Hello, everybody. Welcome. We are here with episode 4, the one where we deployed. I'm Melissa McKay. I'm a developer advocate with JFrog, and I'm always looking for ways to make developers' lives easier, and deployment is definitely one of those ways. I am here with...
Yeah, and I'm Damian Curry. I'm the technical director for the Community and Alliances team at NGINX, and yeah, we're trying to see what NGINX can do to help make developers' lives easier as well.
Awesome. So we've gotten pretty far on our little demo project. We've set up our continuous integration at least, and we've got things building. But now we need to talk about deployment. And I don't mean just to production. What I'm actually talking about is continuous delivery, which is the ability to take any of our builds, potentially deploy them anywhere. So there's several different environments we want to be able to do this with. And I think I'm just going to pick the top 4 and let's just go through and talk about those.
Yeah.
Those are the dev environment, the QA environment, a staging environment, and a production environment.
Yeah. And it's good to remember that those are some pretty commonly used names, but also, I mean, everybody's got their different names for their different things. And I've worked places where the dev was more QA and QA was more dev, and things always go like that. But I think it's the important thing is kind of that those 4, it feels like 4 levels are kind of the minimum for doing CD and CI in my mind, right? Because it gives you enough separation to test everything, but not complexity for complexity's sake.
Yeah. And it doesn't hold up other groups. So also depending on how your organization is built, if you've got a group of folks that are responsible for QA testing specifically, they don't want to have to constantly be disturbed by new deployments all the time while devs iterate at the very beginning, because we do oftentimes what ends up to be some trial and error in some cases. When we do those initial iterations.
Yeah. And it's also good because there also may be multiple dev environments, right? There, a lot of times, because same thing, you don't want to, I mean, I know I've run into that plenty of times where you push a new build and it breaks, but nothing because you were doing is that somebody else was trying to push a new build too. And you start, running into each other and then spending too much time troubleshooting a problem that's not real.
Yeah, exactly. Or random stuff going wrong with your build server. I've certainly had that happen to me before.
That's the other fun part, right?
Yeah, all of these things. And a lot of those things, need to prep you for deployment. You've got to be able to operate at scale, right? Be able to handle all of these commits and check-ins from all of your developers. You don't want stuff falling over just because you have your polling frequency too small or too often. And, things like that. Or like my favorite one was just running out of space because I didn't realize I needed to delete builds as you go.
It is always fun. You get some really weird errors when you run out of disk space sometime. Yeah. And it's amazing how low down the troubleshooting list is. Wait, have I looked at how much storage space I actually have? But yeah.
Yep. And when you start dealing with Docker images, and our project is full of Docker images, that becomes even more apparent because even your storage and everything of those Docker images can grow out of control if you're not paying attention carefully to how you're building them.
Well, and even when depending on how you're building it, right? If you're not using the, kind of correct method to kind of flatten those images out, what should be a really tiny Docker image all of a sudden just balloons up because, somebody was just throwing directives into a Docker file and didn't really understand fully what they were doing. So there's a lot of different ways that can bite you.
Yeah. I've seen one thing, that seemed to be a good idea. Maybe something we might want to implement too is just some guardrails for that to monitor the size of the images. And if you have a big enough change that throws an alert so that you're aware that that's happening. Before you run into trouble.
And things like that are, it's kind of the real benefit of doing this CI process and to keep an eye on things like that. It's not necessarily, that it's going to throw a bunch of errors, right? Maybe you have the huge Docker image and it works just fine in your testing, but there's usually something wrong. If there's a bit of there's a large change between a minor version, right? So it's
Right.
usually indicative of something else that could be wrong elsewhere in the build process. And usually you don't find out for sure until it rolls into production and blows up in your face. So
Yeah, exactly. So the ideal situation is to have your deployment processes to be similar across all of your environments. But
yes.
in my experience, there's going to be some differences. And let's just talk about them specifically, just so we get some real life perspective on some of these. So for a developer deploying for dev, I mean, sometimes it's an entire environment, but
Mhm.
often for me, I like to limit my scope as much as possible and deploy locally on my own machine somewhere.
Yeah.
And in this particular case, for this application, I might not even build a Docker image. I might just launch the service locally
Yeah.
and, just so that I can work with features or whatever. And then before I check in, of course, I would want to go ahead and build the Docker image, make sure I don't mess that up before throwing that into production. So, but realistically, I'm going to have a different deployment environment for my machine.
Yeah.
This project it's Spring Boot, so I am able to, if I needed to, just take one specific service, bring it up. Now, the complication is it doesn't necessarily work for a sanity test or anything unless I have all the others running as well. So you have some options there. You can either run them also run them locally, which you can run into problems if you've got applications where you have dozens of these services, right? That gets to become a little unrealistic. So that's where you might have a developer environment where
Yeah.
you actually have a cloud deployment or something internally set up so that all those other services you're not working on right then, you can be running those live, and then you can work on your local
Yeah.
service.
And I think that's always one of the great ways to do it. And especially, when it comes to one of the reasons why we're, building this around Docker images and Kubernetes is it really lets you have that. And I mean, hey, best case scenario, got a powerful enough laptop, you just run Minikube on there or Kind or whatever local distro Kubernetes you want and get even closer. But yeah, it is always important to have that. And there's always going to be those steps. When the way I always thought about it is once we kind of hit that dev stage, that's when it kind of becomes real, right? There's a lot of tests and things that are done locally, and however you enable your developers to have access to those resources. But it was always kind of, in my mind, that's where I got involved once it hit dev. So that's when you got to start dealing with the ops guys, and you got to start dealing with that sort of system. And it's really good to have it, in my experience, be as close to the production one as you can, and just so you take out any of those wrinkles before it gets there. And the way I've always done it historically is, dev is kind of we're pretty close, but we do a lot of things a little bit more, cowboy like yeah, whatever, just mess with that one service, don't care. You get to QA and okay, there's probably going to be some little tweaks, because a lot of times the QA team has to go in and maybe do a little patch on a specific thing to test and to help the dev team, so there's communication there. But really, it's once you hit staging, or UAT is another thing that it gets called somewhat regularly as well. That's really that spot where you need to be as close to production as possible, if nothing else. I mean, mimic it exactly. You really,
Yeah.
what I've done in the past is have it look exactly like production, but limiting some of the resources, right? So if you're using like database as a service, or you're not going to spin up a production size database, but you're going to use that database as a service, maybe in a smaller iteration, but so that you have that real, okay, it's going to be talking to this database, and trying to really iron out any of that stuff before you hit that last go and cause a real outage.
Great. Yeah. One thing that I struggled with this project just a little bit is how I'm used to dealing with deploying and releasing Java projects in
Mm,
general, because we have this whole idea of snapshots, which is your development iteration, right? And then when you're ready to actually release, you would, basically just edit your POM, get rid of any snapshot dependencies or anything, make sure everything is a release dependency. You change your release version number, you specify that right there, and then you do a release. Well, I mean, best practices, once you actually do a release, the understanding is that you've done all of this testing, you've done, all the QA and stuff. But really, if you have to rebuild at all, you kind of need to start all over. So you have this release, but it needs to go through all of those quality gates before it can be pushed to production.
Yeah.
Which is, there's kind of a push and pull there, because if you've done most of the work already and then now you just have to rebuild just for the sake of changing a version number, that seems silly.
Yeah, and it's always a balance, right? Like it all these different choices really have to be tailored to the application we're working on and the people you have on staff. I know a lot of times people seem to get stuck when they look at some of these things like a checklist, like, okay, well, I need to have this, my dev has to look this way, QA has to look like this. And it's like, no, this is guidelines. Like it's never going to be a cookie cutter for anybody. And if it was, you probably aren't building anything that interesting. So it's one of those fun things where, it's really like, you got to tweak it to what works for you, because if you have a CI process that takes so much manual intervention, people aren't going to use it. And if you're not going to use it, it's like, well, just get rid of it then, right? So you really have to tailor it. And, and I've worked in places where they try to do kind of the top down, like developers will follow this process. And it's like, that's never going to work. You need to try to come together and figure out like, okay, these are the requirements that one side has, and these are the things the other side needs to get their stuff done. So how do we find a middle ground that in theory is going to make everybody's life easier? Because that's really the whole idea of all of this CI/CD stuff. Is it's supposed to take that headache off of you instead of causing more stress.
Right, exactly. So something that terrified me a little bit, since I'm so used to this Java release process, is when I started looking at the POMs for this particular project, it controls the artifact name that gets spit out at the end. So normally that would be what you would version, right? But the way images are versioned is a little different. And I actually like it better, because there's this mechanism where you can tag a particular image, which represents a build, but you can tag it multiple ways. So it could be the latest. It could also be the release candidate. And then later, once it goes through all of those quality gates and is deployed to all the different environments and approved, it can become the release without having to be rebuilt. Yeah.
Again, it's kind of that, why do all of the work just to change a version number? You're not actually making a change. So let's just tag the image differently. I mean, we prove the image works, don't need to rebuild it just so that we can say this is the production one. I feel better knowing that it's the exact same image that was promoted through the stack. So that the image didn't even get rebuilt. It's the same image you tested in staging. So it's going to work. Yep.
And the other advantage to that is, like, even though it seems it's like such a minor thing to just change a version number, like you would to rebuild a Java project, for example, or just mess with the, properties file or whatever, you're actually messing with bits within the build. And if your build machine has to rebuild, there's no guarantee it's going to be exactly the same.
Yes.
Your build server could have changed. There could be newer, or, something could have happened there. Maybe there's some version that wasn't exactly nailed down, and you're getting an upgrade without realizing it. I mean, there's all kinds of things that could go wrong.
Or maybe the build server just decided it didn't like you at that moment and decided to give you a weird thing, because I know that's happened plenty of times where there's no reason or explanation, but it doesn't work, and you run it again and it does. So, that's sometimes it's just the way things go.
So let's talk about a little bit, maybe some of the differences between deploying to, a QA or a staging area as opposed to deploying to production. And one of the biggest things I can think of is in your QA, possibly staging areas, you're going to have maybe not just an individual application deployed there. You might have all of the components deployed so that you can run some integration tests, making sure that the one component you're releasing is actually still compliant and working well with the others. I mean, this is testing that would need to happen probably after, the initial development iterations, because now you're talking to other services.
Yeah, and that it does always get tricky, especially when you're dealing with those like shared services, right? Where it's something your application needs, but an entire different team is managing it. Thankfully, we're working on a little bit smaller scale, our project, so we kind of solve some of those problems. But it is honestly, it's one of the downsides of the whole microservices based architectures. They're great for many reasons, and there's lots of upsides. But when you have these shared services that are great and really help development, it also just adds that other layer of complexity of, you might get different behavior in production because you're not the only service using that shared service now. In your testing, you had free reign, and now maybe you run into tables being locked or, things like that have nothing to do with your piece of the application, but need to be tested somehow when you're rolling it up to production.
Yeah, that makes sense. Which is why we really need it to be as similar as possible to production. When you're, our application that we're playing with has databases, so we need to make sure that, we're doing okay there. I would like to explore, in the future, making an update to the database and going through that process. That'll be interesting, and going through all of the promotion and the quality gates there to make sure that that's okay. As far as, deploying to production, I mean, this is where it really matters. So if you have an application that needs to stay alive, there's some different things that you can do to deploy new versions, versus an application where everyone understands it's going down for maintenance at a specific time for a specific amount of time. It's just going to depend really on what your application is and what it's doing. But yeah.
Hopefully we're getting farther and farther away from the maintenance windows, and we're Sunday at 2 a.m. right? We're doing these deployments, and right there is one of the big reasons. Like I said, there's the downsides for microservice architectures, but this is really the upsides. Is you're able to do that, rolling release of new versions. I mean, you can do blue, green, and canary deployments, to make sure even when you get to production, you're not doing a full swap over. Right. So that's really where you get that power back. And, you don't have that, oh my God, is it going to break every time you push a new release? Because hopefully, I know this is one of the other big topics, is you need to have a rollback plan. Mm-hmm. And when you have that, I've found personally, you get a lot more cavalier when I just hit this button and it all goes away and back to what it was. So it's definitely one of those benefits of just being able to go, yeah, it might break, but we have a lot of checks in place to make sure that if it does break, it's going to break and hopefully not impact many users.
Yeah. I was on a team for a while where we were pretty strict about making sure that not only did we test the deployment, but we tested the rollback. So that was one of the great advantages of having, like a staging environment. We actually went through the full deployment process that we would go through on the day of, it was deployed to production. So we could be sure that we didn't miss anything. And time it saved us. We discovered once, we entirely missed migrating a production, migrating a database, for example. That would have been a very sad scenario in production if we had done it in production. Yeah. And we did in the past. So this was a process that we put in place in order to avoid that ever happening again.
Yeah. And thankfully, with Kubernetes again, and these, more microservice based systems, the rollback becomes so much easier because you can still leave the old version up and running. You just kind of start chipping away. And that's where this all for me is going to get really fun, is when we can actually start doing that deployment and having the ingress controller go ahead and automatically do this rollout and slowly, get that feedback loop going. So you go, okay, well, we've got it out there. It passed the basic tests. Okay, let's start bleeding a little bit of traffic over, whether you want to use a header or a percentage or, whatever you have, and watching it and going, okay, that's fine. Let's keep rolling out a little bit more. And then if something blows up, the old one's still there. You just turn off the new one and you're back to normal. So all of that stuff, it's really the plus side of all this complexity that some of this stuff adds into your infrastructure.
Yep. And when you get to databases, that even gets more complicated. You have to be careful.
Databases are a whole nother thing, and especially that's maybe a conversation for another day. But when you get into those Kubernetes environments, then that really does become the big question: is where do you put your database? Right?
Yeah.
Because containers aren't great for databases, right? It's not the most logical way to do it. I mean, even cloud instances historically haven't been great for databases, right? That's one of the reasons why there are so many databases as service offerings. And, obviously a lot of those problems have been fixed, but it's one of those big questions, especially again, in these, microservice shared infrastructure architectures, is not only, what kind of database you're using, but how it's being deployed so that that as the load ramps up from your application, possibly the other one's using it, you're not going to get into a bad situation where all of a sudden you have an overloaded database and everything grinds to a halt.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. These are things, scenarios you need to think of, especially when you're, putting in new data or getting rid of old data. It's almost like you need to treat that database as an entirely separate application with its own release cycle and all of that management around it. Definitely more complicated.
Yeah, you can't really take the move fast and break things approach with your database, because when it breaks, it really breaks.
So let's talk a little bit about where exactly we deploy. So, these other environments, as much as we want them to be exactly like production, sometimes they aren't. It might be, an internal situation. For your staging area, it would be nice to be, out in the same environment as your production, like
obviously
in the cloud environment.
Yeah, for cost reasons. I mean, you just can't have it look exactly like production all the way through, because you just be throwing money down the drain, because you don't need those resources, right? So it is always interesting. And again, with Kubernetes now, it really makes it a lot more flexible, because you can do these tests that are at a much smaller scale, and even, like I said, could be run locally if you have enough, CPU and RAM on your development machine. You can run a pretty much mirror image of your Kubernetes cluster locally. And being able to do that, or even being able to have, your automation spin up one of those, kind or Minikube or something like that, so it can spin up a entire cluster really quickly, throw all the code at it, do a quick, sanity check, and just kill it afterwards too. Because you're just like, okay, everything works, we're done, turn it off, now roll to the next one.
Yep. Yeah, it makes it really easy to if you have it developed that it can be deployed in Kubernetes, you can go to any cloud too. You're not locked in to a particular vendor.
It is definitely one of those things where the whole selling point of the cloud, right? That was that we don't have to be in one place. You can move your infrastructure wherever you need it to be, but as you develop for one cloud, you go, oh man, they'll do the database stuff for me. Cool. Oh, they'll do this for me. And then all of a sudden you're stuck with that cloud provider. Kubernetes is kind of getting us that next step closer of going, okay, well, if you just have Kubernetes, we can deploy onto it, which makes it a lot easier to do that, possibly multi-cloud, possibly just cloud migrations, because you don't have the same requirements when you start that you're going to have when, your application blows up and needs a lot more traffic. So it's really good to be able to, with a lot of these, you may not be able to afford AWS. You may not be able to afford, the big vendors and the, their easy button services, right? Like, it's hosted Kubernetes is great, but like everything else, they're charging you a premium for it. So being able to kind of have that freedom and also plan it in with the idea that, hey, we're deploying here for now, but we're going to make the assumption, we're going to hope that we outgrow this provider, right? And then we have to move somewhere else.
Right. Also, like the stock market, there's this idea that maybe, depending on one provider, is the same as putting all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly.
So at some point, you may even want to consider, running your service in multiple clouds. I remember, oftentimes I'll see these alerts that come through, for particular applications that say, this entire zone in AWS is down. And all I can think is like, oh, well, they're working on it. They're doing stuff. I love, they give you a status and everything. But at those times, I'm thankful that at least for this particular application I'm talking about, at least it's running also in other zones and even in other clouds. So not everyone is down.
And even
really get to
even
protect yourself that way.
You even get the fun part, like, what was that a while ago? The AWS had a authentication issue. It was only in one region, but it made it so that, like, nobody could spin up new instances. Anything you had running was fine. So there's even just little things like that. And especially if it's an emergency, right? And you need to get a replica set up somewhere, you don't have the time to go, oh, wait, what vendor specific services are we leveraging? Right. And if you have that comfort of, knowing that it's like, oh, no, we plan for this. Like, I can just point this at a different cluster and it'll just deploy and work. And again, it really, it takes a lot of that dread out of you. And you're like, oh, well, it could go wrong, but I've got a solution already.
Yeah. Just that ability to have your plan B ready to go is going to relieve a lot of pressure. And I mean, probably one of the biggest reasons that a lot of web applications have, gone to the cloud, right? I mean, gone are the days where, individual organizations are trying to keep up with keeping their own data centers and their own, physical servers running and everything. And there is a trade in cost, but, a lot of organizations don't want to have to expend all that they need to have all of that infrastructure set up.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
It is kind of the fun part is it's almost like when you go through these CI build processes and you're building these different staging environments, you're really kind of planning for that too, because that it's just like, I can just build this. So it's again, it really just adds that freedom of knowing that you can go somewhere else if you have to. And you've hopefully already done the work to make it, probably not seamless, but a lot easier than refactoring an entire application.
Yeah. You brought something up. It just reminded me and another advantage of having these different environments that you deploy to, but knowing how your application behaves when things go wrong. That's super important. And it's always better to kind of know a lot of that stuff in advance before it actually happens to you in production. It's one thing to say, oh, have a plan B, but you kind of need to know what that plan B is. So being able to test in an environment that's similar to production, to be able to, shut off traffic somewhere or, cause a problem with one of your components, just to see how everything behaves.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I know I've worked at plenty of places where, there'll be a service running somewhere and everybody's going, what is that? And they go, nobody knows, but don't touch it. Last time we did it broke everything. And you're going, oh man, that's not reassuring. But if you have all these different environments, you can go, no. What happens if I turn it off? Like, let me turn it off here and let's see. Right. And just, that ability to be able to, find those dependencies inside of your own infrastructure, because there always are. And there's always going to be that thing that, somebody implemented and, somebody forgot about. So it's, being able to replicate those, it just, makes your life so much easier in the long run.
There's only so much a developer can do on the developer side too. Like I've seen cases where, stuff has been implemented to kind of help protect, but at the end of the, in production, if that went down, it would actually cause dominoes and all of the services to go down. So, that would never be apparent unless you tried that in production with, messing with actual changes in your infrastructure that has nothing to do with your source code, right?
Yeah.
Being able to understand how it behaves. So important. There's a couple of other options out there rather than going directly to the cloud, your AWS or your Google Cloud or Microsoft or whatever you choose. There's some other vendors out there that maybe are one layer up. Maybe they work off of those infrastructures, but maybe make things a little bit easier for
or also or even just making things a little bit cheaper. I've personally done a lot of work in there, and I've worked with companies and groups that have had this exact progression of leveraging something like DigitalOcean. It's a cloud provider, but it's it's not AWS, it's not Azure, it's not GCP. But the big benefit is it's cheap and it's simple, right? And 90% of the time, for especially small startup sort of projects, it has more than enough to do what you need to do. I mean, they've got Kubernetes as a service that's way cheaper than any as a service you can get from the other cloud providers. They've got, database as a service, load balancer as a service. They've got all the basics. And, like I said, it's cheaper, which is always a big thing when you're trying to just get off the ground here. And it's really, really straightforward. It just is kind of distills down a lot of the cloud stuff and removes the things that, kind of smaller groups don't want to worry about, and just really streamlines the whole process.
Yeah, I know, some of the cloud providers, there's a lot of levers you can pull, a lot of things you can set and change and configure and customize. And sometimes just having another service that's a little more opinionated so that you can just choose, like, what's my intent? And then, just be able to do what you need to do without worrying about a lot of the details.
Yeah, you're probably not going to be able to appease enterprise security team at a big Fortune 500 that DigitalOcean is going to work. But, for a more startup thing, I mean, it's a great place to start. And one of the things I really have always liked about them is they do have that opinionated kind of stance of, we're just going to keep it simple. But they also keep it simple when it comes to like the Kubernetes thing. The Kubernetes as a service, it is just Kubernetes, right? I can tell you we've run into a lot of issues with, things like AKS, EKS, where they have a version number for Kubernetes, but it's not actually the vanilla Kubernetes. So you run into compatibility issues. Even though the Kubernetes version is exactly the same, there's slightly different behaviors in the other environment. So that's one of the other reasons I really like it is just plain Kubernetes. There's no special sauce added by them.
Nice. And they take over managing the cluster, right? Upgrading it when needed or whatever. And you kind of eliminate that whole headache.
Having that, they handle the kind of control plane level there. You've got your other instances, but it makes it a lot easier. It stands up way faster than I can stand up a Kubernetes cluster manually. And and again, especially in these situations where you've got a small group, kind of startup mentality, it's, you probably got, a couple developers and maybe a couple of ops platform people. So the less time that those folks can spend managing Kubernetes, the control plane of Kubernetes, and instead focus on managing the applications that you actually want to run in it, is always going to make life better for everyone.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've been on teams where, it's a big enough organization and large enough number of teams that we actually had an entire internal team that managed our Kubernetes clusters internally. Yeah. That's great for that situation, but I don't think most organizations are in that situation.
No, I think
it's overkill, not necessary, and sure is nice to offload that to the experts that deal with that every day.
Yeah, the ones who have already had to figure out exactly the upgrade process, right? Exactly. We're trying to figure that out in our own application. I don't have time to figure that out for Kubernetes. We'll let the people hosting it for us deal with that.
Right. Well, we are now to the point, I think, where we can start bringing in Mara into this conversation.
Yeah.
Because not only are we concerned about deployment, but we're concerned about the infrastructure behind it. And I think it's time to let everyone know some of the exciting stuff that's going on there.
Yeah, it's been a fun project since it started, and ever since we've been working on this project, Melissa, whereas I've really been thinking about this as this is kind of the second stage of our reference architecture, where Mara being the modern application reference architecture, which none of us like the name, but we couldn't come up with a better one, so we're stuck with it.
Stuck with it now.
Yeah, we what we really wanted to show was partially the complexity of Kubernetes and of the other infrastructure tooling. I think as one of my coworkers coined the term, it's like the app is just the tip of the iceberg, right? Everybody's focused on the application and they think, well, it's on Kubernetes. That's easy. It's like, okay, well, there's also your observability running in Kubernetes. There's also your logging running in there, your metrics. So there are a lot of other tools that you need to manage and you need to have there that have nothing to do with your application, right? It's mainly there for when something goes wrong that you know what's happening. But it creates a lot of overhead. And we were also really wanting to approach it in this same kind of, CI/CD mentality. We wanted to be able to show how to do this in a fully automated manner that was repeatable. And, like I was mentioning with running into version mismatches, that's exactly how we found this out. We have Jenkins running as a build server for this project, and we were spinning up instances of it in AWS, Azure, and in DigitalOcean. The failure rate for DigitalOcean was nothing compared to the other two. For one, even just the amount of time it takes to stand up, but then also running into the dependencies of different versions and version mismatch. So we definitely learned a lot building out this whole project, and we're currently kind of not necessarily starting over, where we never intended this to be like a single reference architecture. It was more, we wanted to show it was like a collection of like, hey, everybody loves to talk about modern applications, but that doesn't actually mean anything. It's really what a modern application is. This stuff, it's being able to leverage CI/CD pipelines to build this infrastructure that is resilient and scalable and can just push it out wherever it needs to go. And by doing that, you're ending up with an application that will be you can push out changes all the time and not worry about it. You can keep delivering, you can match the requirements easily from your end user. So if you get really popular, you can spin up more, and it's been automated. And one of the things we did from the beginning in our first kind of iteration of the project that's still out there, and NGINX.com/Mara will take you right to the GitHub repo. We were really trying to build a push button deployment that would stand up what would be, I hate saying production ready because I don't believe it is, but building it with that mentality of this isn't just a toy. We want to actually use some of the experience the folks on our team have from running infrastructure and building things like this before, and really having something that not only kind of gives an example of a modern application architecture, but also does it in a way that you can maybe not fully understand everything, and it also turned into a really great learning tool for Kubernetes, because, it's hard enough standing up Kubernetes, but then once it's up and running, cool, what now? Like there's some random services running, but I don't know Kubernetes. I don't know what any of that means. But with this project, we were pushing out and just standing up, Kubernetes, logging, observability, and then also installing an application on top of that. That is a microservices-based application, and really giving it that full picture. Well, from what we learned doing that one and working on that a lot is that, we love that we have this push button, like single, just hit go, and it just runs and does it all. But the more we worked with, the more we're like, well, this really isn't production though. You don't build and deploy your infrastructure and application at the same time, right? You're not using the same code. It's great to have that. So what we've started working on now is we're really looking at kind of stepping back and taking an even more of a building block approach, and more building these different chunks that you can then bring together and have the infrastructure side done, and then have it kick off something that then goes and configures your CI/CD pipeline to target that endpoint. So it really ends up with this something that hopefully is more useful for people when they're trying to get things going. And, just really kind of showing that the idea of having it being more building blocks so that, for example, you always are going to make a decision when you deploy something. It's not necessarily going to be the right decision 6 months down the road. And
Right.
we actually ran into this with our, the current iteration of Mara, where we were like, okay, we need logging, elk stack. Everybody uses elk stack. Cool. Done. Easy. Well, after a while, when we started throwing some load at it, we realized that it was just killing our cluster. But because we had kind of at least taken some of the thought process ahead of time that we want these pieces to be swappable, we were able to pretty easily go in, pull out the chunk of code that was deploying elk stack and replace it with another logging solution. So really taking that approach so that it becomes this, easier to leverage, kind of building block approach so that we can have different implementations of it. And that's why I've been really excited working on this whole thing, because it's really bringing this together, and we really want to show like both sides of it, because it's everything is code, right? And it's infrastructure is code, networking is code, and what have you. And I feel like a lot of times the gut reaction is go, oh, it's all code. We just treat it all the same way. But it's not. It is the same, but it's not the same. You don't iterate on your infrastructure the way you iterate on your applications.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
it's really interesting to kind of highlight that and show that, like, yeah, you do want your infrastructure stuff in the CI/CD pipeline, but maybe not necessarily the same one, because it's, and having again kind of those building blocks. So like you said, if I need to test a new build of this specific service, okay, I can just deploy that service and the stuff underneath it that I need, or I can deploy everything, or it just gives you that freedom. And again, talking about emergencies and needing to get onto a different hosting provider to something goes catastrophically wrong, you have that stuff built into your CI/CD pipeline. You can just go, okay, never mind, target this provider instead of that provider, and it should just go.
Yeah. Yeah. So, these are all valuable things to think about. And like you said, a lot of it is external to the application. I mean, we all have these concepts we worry about. We worry about, being able to observe our application after it's out there, being able to handle logging, and then making that pluggable. I like that idea, being able to switch to a different product if your needs change.
One of
that's
our
really important to be able to do.
Yeah, and one of the big focuses, and I think my whole team is sick of me saying it, but it's protocols over products, right? That's one of the main things we're really trying to focus on, because if you focus on implementing a protocol, even if it's not, a technical protocol, right? But if we're implementing something, say we're dealing with observability, well, instead of implementing the, Datadog specific thing, we can just implement Prometheus, and then there's all of these different providers that can just grab that Prometheus metric. Same with like the elk stack stuff. Even if you don't like elk, a lot of those logging providers will use that same logging agent. So then you can still install that agent, and your automation just points it at a different endpoint to dump the logs into.
Yeah, that makes sense. We've grown so much in the past several years. I always like to compare it to like car manufacturing, right? And I feel like we're getting to the point now where we've got appropriate delineation between the different parts, like what makes sense to be able to remove and replace.
Yeah.
And obviously we're much further along with cars, automobiles than we are with our software when it comes to stuff like this, but we're learning and we're getting better. And I like seeing, new tools come out that solve issues in different ways. And then, eventually the community kind of converges on a solution, converges on best practices.
Mm-hmm.
All of this is going to help us be able to produce faster and more efficiently.
Yeah, exactly. And it is, just looking at making sure that, we're giving people the tools they need to do to get the job done, right? It doesn't necessarily matter how you get there, right? It's just that you get there. and, having this information out there and just showing, right? And especially that communication between teams. There's always been that kind of, good natured, sometimes bad natured, a lot of times kind of, headbutting between your operations and your development team. Everybody loves to talk about DevOps, but there's still, if we're calling it the platform team or whatever, but trying to also get those teams together and be like, no, look, we're trying to do the same thing. We just view it from different angles. Cause I kind of look at things from the infrastructure up, and then I'm sure you kind of come from the application down. So you always end up meeting in the middle, but it's just trying to make sure that everybody's on the same page too.
Yeah. Makes sense. Yep, we're getting there. I'm excited working on this demo with you with this, a given application, perhaps using Mara, using some of the tools that we've talked about, just to see, since we know starting this project, we knew there were lots of permutations, just having something to start with and work with and see how it goes. I think this will be valuable for the community to take a look at and maybe take it for themselves and switch something out, see how it behaves.
Yeah.
See if they like that better.
That's the whole thing when we've been working on Mara and when we started working on this, one of the things that really is like the driving thing I keep in my mind is I want to make something that I would have been pumped to stumble across when I was running infrastructure.
Yes.
Because it's always that if we do all this work and one person finds it and goes, oh man, that's how you do it. Good enough, right? Like, it's just that putting a real world example, because everybody loves to have, diagrams and fancy blogs talking about how you could build all this fancy infrastructure and how you could automate your CI/CD pipeline, but you never really get an actual demo you can take and play with.
We have too much hand waving of the details.
Yeah. Or like you can have a great demo if you talk to this sales rep and he'll walk you through this thing. And it's like, okay, well, the reason you're probably walking me through that is because it's not repeatable. So what good is it if you can't make it happen again? So that's one of the really big things, is just like, this should be something that people can take and play with and figure it out on their own. Cause I know that's how I learn stuff. So hopefully we'll help other people with that.
Same. I learn by doing. And the position I'm in right now, since I'm not so much under the gun that a lot of engineers are, they've got to make sure they're meeting deadlines and getting these features and bugs fixed or whatever in a certain amount of time. Being able to do this research with you and actually go through it and, occasionally headbutt.
Yeah. Well,
like
it's always going to be
hit a wall, have to, try something different. This is all good stuff. And I'm hoping we can, come out with something that will definitely be useful for people in the future.
Yeah, definitely. It was funny when we were working on this, we had the same thought of just being like, oh man, this is great. It's like building a production environment, but without that pesky actually having to go into production thing. So exactly. It lets you spend more time on some things than you would, in a real world scenario where you just don't have the time. Yeah.
Yeah. Some of the process I've gone through with this application and just, setting some things up. There's some things, you'll come across instructions that just say, click here, do this. Not a lot of like, why? Why are we doing that? Why is this done this way? Sometimes there's a historical reason. Sometimes, we have to pause, step back, find out why before proceeding. And it takes longer, it's a little slower, but it's worth it. We need that information out there. I know a lot of documentation works that way, right? It tells you what to do, but not why you're doing it. So you don't even know, like, this is how you set this setting. Well, why would I set that setting that way?
Yeah.
Why would I set it differently? What circumstances? What scenario?
Yeah. What is the reasoning, right? That's what it's always great. And I'm really hoping that we provide that context to somebody here when they stumble across our ramblings.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, this is great. Let's take off. Let's start working on our deployment processes for each of these environments, potential environments for us, and see what we run into and get closer to having a finished product here.
Yeah, we'll keep chugging along. It was great catching up like always.
Awesome. Thanks, Damian. See you next time.
Bye-bye.